Good evening and welcome to the Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for this Wednesday, January 9th, 2019. Could we have the roll call?
Atkins?
Here.
Arnson? Girusso?
Here.
Hartley?
Here.
Holst?
Here.
Leeper? Oberly? Saul?
Here.
Wingert?
Here.
And Larson. Sorry, I called our old commissioner, not our new one, but Mr. Larson's not here yet either. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first order of business is the approval of the minutes from the December 12th, 2018 meeting. Is there any corrections or a motion?
So moved to approve.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. At this time, I would open the floor to anybody who wants to speak to the commission on general comments not related to the items of business tonight. If there's anything else, anybody here that has a comment? Seeing none, we will carry on to our first item of business, which is a public hearing. Zoning code text amendments, proposed changes to section 29160 of the College Hill Neighborhood Overlay Zoning District to define and clarify standards for mixed-use buildings. And Karen or David, who's going to introduce that one?
I'll introduce that item. Just note that the public notice was in the paper and that has been entered into the public record.
Yeah, do we need to vote on that or?
I don't think so. I think
Okay.
it's fine.
Just
So this is some fairly refined zoning code text amendments for section 29160 of the College Hill Neighborhood Overlay Zoning District. The goal for these particular code amendments is to establish clear and objective standards in the code to facilitate consistent review and approval of development in the College Hill neighborhood, particularly in the core C3 district of the business district of the College Hill neighborhood. These further the existing goals of the business district to improve pedestrian access, spur local development of more mixed-use storefronts with apartment dwellings above, and link the upper hill and the lower hill along College Street into a more cohesive and walkable area. These are goals that are listed in our comprehensive plan, so these code amendments are intended to sort of facilitate that. Staff notes that the proposed changes to the code to add a fairly substantial parking requirement for upper floor residential in new mixed-use buildings is intended to be an interim fix potentially until a more detailed parking study can be conducted in the College Hill neighborhood. I think everybody acknowledges that we need to study the parking on the hill to get a grasp on how well and how the public parking facilities are being used, the parking lots and the on-street parking, and how that's interplaying with the private off-street parking that we should be monitoring as well. So to achieve the goals outlined in the comprehensive plan, it's important to study those aspects. We did note in the staff report, we wanted to highlight that there are some hidden costs to setting aside land for parking. And so that's one of the reasons to be pretty careful about how we set the parking requirements in this urban district. Because the loss of valuable land that could otherwise be used for active and revenue generating uses such as businesses and housing, if requiring too much parking, for example, beyond what is needed, it imposes an unnecessary cost to development, and that translates directly into higher costs for residential rents and for higher lease rates for businesses. So it kind of trickles down to the end users, and if we don't need that much parking, that makes it that much more expensive for development to occur. Another aspect is that large surface parking lots interrupt what otherwise might be a more pleasant and comfortable place to walk, with buildings close to the street, clustered together, creating that walkable character that we are striving for in the College Hill neighborhood. And so parking lots, particularly empty parking lots, create a real dead zone in a business district. And on the flip side, it also discourages walking and biking when businesses and housing are more spread out. So it takes you longer to get to your destination, and if you have to walk past an empty parking lot or even a full parking lot is not the most pleasant place to walk. So it discourages that walking and biking that we're trying to encourage on the hill. And then high parking requirements may then discourage that kind of redevelopment that we're striving for. So getting to those zoning code amendments, as you know, we have we have ambiguous and confusing language in the code that's caused a lot of frustration on the part of the commission, staff, and developers, and the community. So we wanted to eliminate that ambiguous and confusing code language related to mixed-use buildings. So we've added a new definition of the code for a mixed-use building. Building is a building designed for occupancy by a minimum of 2 different uses. So typically, uses generating visitor or customer traffic would be on the ground level floor, facing the street, and uses generating limited pedestrian traffic, such as office or residential uses, are typically located on upper floors or behind the street fronting commercial uses. So that's just the general definition of what a mixed-use building is. And then it's further, then once we have it defined, we can establish a parking standard for a mixed-use building and distinguish between the commercial uses in the building and residential uses. So what we're proposing here is to establish a parking standard of 1 parking space per bedroom for the upper floor residential, but not less than 1 parking space per unit, so that studio apartments would have 1 parking space as well. So all unit sizes are treated the same, so that you get a general, the idea is that you calculate the parking for the entire building, so that it all evens out in the end. So it could be that you might have 2 people in a studio apartment or a 1-bedroom apartment that both have cars, but then you might have people in a 3-bedroom apartment that only have 2 cars. So that when you even it out for the whole building, you get a pretty good ratio for the whole project. Now, it's of course changes from year to year, but that's a pretty good estimate then of what you might need for the whole project. So once again, we just caution that this may still be too high for this urban setting. I think we heard some of that at the last meeting. There's some concern about that, but we can adjust this tool in the future if we find out through the parking study that needs to be adjusted again one way or the other. We can do that. It does eliminate also the requirement for visitor parking. Public parking is a resource that can more efficiently be shared, and where there is a lot of public parking in the area, it seems to be more suitable for visitor parking that would vary from time to time of day. And then to be fair across the system, there are some higher density residential zones right next to the C3 district. We're establishing the same parking standard then for multiple dwelling buildings as for the mixed-use buildings, so that everybody gets the same simplified parking requirement for residential. And then at the last meeting, there was some discussion about what about the existing mixed-use buildings on the Hill, and you had asked staff to come back with a recommendation on some language to basically acknowledge those and make it clear that they can remain conforming in the code and they're exempt from parking requirements. So you notice that language specifically was added to the code. So that would do 2 things. One, it would basically grandfather in any existing apartments that are above commercial in the mixed-use buildings on the Hill. But there may be also mixed-use buildings on the Hill that are underutilized. The upper floors are currently underutilized. It would allow those to convert to residential for a few residential apartments. And because those are probably on sites that there's no room for any parking, and that's such a marginal increase in residential density, that those would also be grandfathered without any, or not grandfathered, but they would not be required to add any parking for a conversion of the upper floor space. Then along with this, because we added a new building type to the code, there are design standards currently in the College Hill overlay that address building design for multifamily and for single family, and duplexes. So this will add building design standards for mixed-use buildings that are similar to the kinds of standards that we talk about for other buildings on the Hill. And then there's some minor cleanup items on the terms while we're in the code cleaning up things. We thought we'd clean up those terms so we make sure it's consistent with the rest of the code. So with that, the Community Development Department recommends approval of the proposed zoning code amendments in section 29-160 College Hill Neighborhood Overlay Zoning District as submitted with the staff report. And I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Karen. Very nice. At this point, I will open the public hearing for public comment and invite anyone in the audience who would like to comment on these proposed ordinance changes to come to the microphone and give your name and address. Anyone?
Hello, Jerry Geisler, 4412 South Hudson Road, Cedar Falls. I didn't get my paperwork into you in time for it to be a part of the record. But anyway, at the last meeting, I can't pronounce your name probably correctly, but Mrs. Goresko said that a lot of our students come from middle-income families. They are looking for a cheaper place to live, and consequently, they want to get out of the dorms, but they're still looking for a cheaper place to live. Well, when you start looking at the history of this thing, you'll find that my tenants, since 1992, have wanted out of the dorms. They wanted into the 4 people, 3 people per unit, and then we find that they want into the 1 person because as they get older, they want to be alone. Well, what happens is they find that when they get into these 1-bedroom units, they can't afford a 1-bedroom unit because the price goes so high. Well, then what they do is they put 2 kids in each one of these units. It's happened to me year after year since 1992. It's happened to me. And as far as the ratio of it, I can go back and show you the history of it because we keep track of how many cars each apartment generates. And year after year, it's been 1.75 cars per 1 bedroom. If you want to look at my 4-bedroom units, you'll find that every one of my 4-bedroom units, every tenant in there has a car, every one of them. So as far as what, I can't say names, as far as what she was saying in regards to your 3- and 4-bedroom bedroom units not having 3 or 4 cars, take a look on 20th Street where I put in 44 parking stalls. 43 of those parking stalls for the last 2 years have been occupied. 43 out of the 44. So my point is that we need to not go with the 1-bedroom, or 1 car per bedroom. We need to go with 1+ parking stalls per bedroom. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Geisler.
I'd like to mention that there are a couple letters that are in front of you today, and one is from Mr. Geisler that was submitted a couple days ago.
Okay, great. So noted. Thank you.
Ishan Vajpayee, 3831 Conver Lane, Cedar Falls. Playing off a little bit of what Mr. Geisler said and referencing back to some conversation that happened at the last meeting, I think there is a distinct difference between any preliminary parking studies coming out of the downtown area in what are pretty nice, pricey developments down there where you might be having young professionals, resident physicians, doctors living, where they might spend the money for the 2-bedroom apartment and only have 1 car, creating some oversupply of parking in those units. But to reiterate what Mr. Geisler said is that on the Hill, these are college students. They're not going to be buying more bedrooms than they need, renting more bedrooms than they need, and they're going to have cars. a survey, and this is sort of a collection of things that have been presented over the last year and a half that we've been having this conversation. A survey done by some landlords of 957 college students showed 98% owned cars. And there certainly can be some parking swaps where one person has a spot and they leave for the day and go to work, and then maybe a commercial visitor can come into that spot until they come home. But that might work downtown with those higher priced units. People get in their car, they drive to the hospital to go to work. But these students are more likely than not parking their cars there all day because they're going to walk from their apartment building on the hill and go to class. There isn't that type of exchange occurring. So that is, another point to say that there has to be some additional ratio for these studio apartments, 1.5 spots per unit, especially with the elimination of the visitor parking. And I think that kind of circles back to the idea that if you're going to revisit brings up the idea that if you're going to revisit the residential parking requirements, I think there should be some consideration about the commercial parking requirements, because you're going to, under the new rubric, you're going to increase residential tenants on the Hill. Because these are mixed-use buildings, you're going to increase commercial tenants with employees of the commercial spaces and visitors to the commercial spaces. And unless everybody who works in that commercial space lives in the commercial space, and everyone who patronizes the commercial space lives in the building, people are going to be driving their cars to visit, people are going to be driving their cars to work. So all we're doing is increasing the flow of traffic, the flow of people to the Hill, and decreasing the residential spots that maybe commercial people had taken advantage of, commercial visitors had taken advantage of in the past if there was an oversupply, and constricting it, and now then there's no commercial parking requirements. So any oversupply that might have been absorbing commercial visitors is gone now. So if you think about it that way, all you're doing is driving more people to the Hill and cutting parking every single place you can. And for the residential portion of it, maybe that's okay. The market will decide whether or not students want to live in a building that doesn't have enough parking for them. That's on the developer. But neighboring businesses will get hurt if you don't also provide some buffer on the commercial side. Because I live pretty close to the Hill, but if I want to go to Sidecar Coffee and get coffee, I have to drive. I'm sorry, you got to drive. Everyone has to drive unless you just stay home all day. There's a prime example of this downtown or on the Hill right now. There's a mixed-use building where Domino's is the bottom floor tenant, and there's upper floor residential. Now, that residential portion doesn't have to be parked. That commercial portion doesn't have to be parked. Well, you say, well, does the commercial portion need parking? Do we need this parking? Some people say no, but as evidence that, yeah, you do, there's a residential building right behind it off of Olive Street that's supposed to have, I think, 26 parking spots to feed its residents. 4 of them have been taken by Domino's, same landlord, just to clarify, it's not been stolen or anything, but the developer has taken 4 of his spots from a residential place, put up signs that say reserved for Domino's employees, and that makes a lot of sense because people who work there gotta have a place to park, and people that work at the Brew Lab going in at 2119 College are gonna have to have a place to park. But all we're doing is reducing parking. I think something to remember is that city lots and street parking aren't there for developers to capture and use for their purposes. Heard a lot about a lot behind, Biggs, Little Biggs, and Social House that's empty a lot. Well, is that to be given away? And I want a couple more things here. Maggie Miller, former director of government relations for Northern Iowa, said this maybe a year ago, and this is a quote. "Every student I know that lives off campus owns a car. There's really not a way to live in the city without a car." Let's listen to the students. She's one of them, was one of them. Quote, "We've had a problem with urban flats." This is going a little bit into the process argument that I'm going to touch on later, but by just reducing this parking now without a parking study, by saying we're going to reduce parking and then maybe change it later on down the road, you know, if it needs to be reevaluated. These kinds of, without sounding too pejorative, fly by the seat of the pants decisions based on some anecdotes and some thoughts from the developer have caused problems. And this is exactly what happened with urban flats. There was supposed to be, it was passed through based on this agreement that all the kids there were going to buy a UNI parking space, a parking pass. First, is there verification that that place is only rented to college students? Is there verification that that place is only rented to University of Northern Iowa students who are eligible to purchase such a parking permit? Second of all, there's only one lot on UNI campus where you can purchase 24-hour lot pass if you're an off-campus student. It's the R lot, and you can still only get that pass if you have a class after 4 p.m. So semester by semester, depending on how the kids' schedules change, they either can or cannot park off-site on the UNI parking campus for 24 hours. And that is just the prime example of how, oh yeah, let's underpark it because the developer says he's going to make them buy UNI lots. That example, that problem that has occurred cannot occur again. More contemplation of this needs to occur after a real parking study, not an anecdote from business owners who are partners of the applicant. To avoid another urban flats debacle. So, that's all I have to say on that point. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Roshbay. Others who would like to address the commission?
Good evening. Kamyar and Cheyenne, board member of the College Hill Partnership, 1703 Washington Street. Several board members of the College Hill Partnership were here last time, and 3 of us are here, and so is the executive director. And we sent a letter. We fully support, really appreciate that you're considering this interim process until a full parking study has been done. We fully support this change in the text. Again, I want to emphasize, again, our goal is vitality of the hill, walkability, bikeability. And again, there's a lot of hearsay, a lot of speculations about what students will do and will not do, but we're here, the staff, we fully support staff's explanation, and for those very reasons, the College Hill Partnership fully supports this change. That we think it's a reasonable step forward, and we really appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cheyenne. Anybody else who would like to address the commission?
Hello. Dan Drendel, Slingshot Architecture, representing the owner of the next College Hill project that we'll look at. But just wanted to quickly say that we very much support what the staff is recommending today. Appreciate your work in requesting clarity and really wanting to move forward with any ambiguity taken out of the question of how the code reads. And so we appreciate staff pushing toward a solution of that you see today, and agree also with the gentleman right before me from the College Hill Partnership about that this is a good interim step before the parking study happens, to where we can get some more recommendations about how to best move toward a more walkable neighborhood that achieves the successful parking solution as well. But our goal is always to work within the goals of the planning efforts of the city, and so we're just happy to have clarity added to the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Anyone else who would like to comment on this proposal?
Dr. Steyer's 1939 College. I agree with most of the comments. I mean, we've had a lot of experience with kids in one-bedrooms and studios, and it's not just one, it's one or more than one. You know, maybe 30 or 50% are two people. So I won't go into that. Mr. Geisler has extensive experience, and it's the same as mine, basically. I only want to talk about the fact that the future is uncertain for this area of town. I got to reading about millennials because everybody talks about them, and I don't know much about them. But apparently they don't go to bars much anymore because there are better ways of meeting people than the bars. And in certain areas of the world, 50% of the bars have gone out of business because kids meet each other on the street with, I don't know the names of these apps, but they know each other, they check each other on Facebook, and they have a hamburger instead of 12 beers. So, you know, the complexion of what happens down in the College Hill area is going to change over time. University of Northern Iowa's been there for 100 years at least, and hopefully it'll go for at least 100 years more. So there's a certain amount of parking, and you know, a lot of times it's adequate, sometimes not as adequate. But I think the question, at least in part, becomes, what happens if you run out of that parking? And also, how do you allocate the city parking? You know, do you give it to developers? Is that really appropriate? Or is it more appropriate for individual developers to park their space? If you look at the development that's in question now on, is it 22nd Street? I think it is. I don't remember what the main base is. Can you tell me what the main base is? Is it 4,000 square feet? I think it might be something like 4,000 or 5,000 square feet, with a tavern proposed to be in there. The current city code, which some read and some don't, requires one parking place for every 100 square feet for a tavern. So if it was 5,000 square feet, the current city code requires 50 parking spaces. Plus it requires one parking space for every 2 employees or so. So when you put mixed building uses in there and don't park them at all, you're going to get huge portions of the city parking lots taken away. And that has happened recently, and nobody is doing anything about it. So I think the question of fairness, you know, when the next one comes and the next one comes and the mixed use comes, what do you make them do? Do you give away the first come, first serve? Or do you try to allocate parking as is really required by a particular development? I'd make one last small point. I don't have any problem with getting rid of visitor spaces. Visitors are transients. They come and they go. College kids, however, they're there for extended periods of time. And you know, they might park for a week or two, or they may go, but they don't just come and go. So when you've got 2 people in a 1-bedroom apartment, those people are occupying spaces for a long period of time. So I would strongly encourage the Planning and Zoning Commission to try to park these developments appropriately, to try to allocate enough parking for each development to what it's actually going to use, and not to give away to developers city parking and to make the 1-bedrooms or studios require at least 1.5 parking spaces. That would make a lot of sense. And then don't forget that, you know, commercial enterprise on the bottom floor may bring a lot of cars in if they're successful. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cyrus.
Hello, Ryan Kreener, 4407 Donald Drive in Cedar Falls. Wanted to, I think last time we talked about possibly having off-site parking for some of these developments because it's such a small area on some of the lots. So I wasn't sure if that was maybe part of the clarification on some of the verbiage or not, but.
We haven't added anything for that. I think that would be part of a parking study. I mean, I think the question is, if we're storing cars there, is that the best use of the most valuable land on the hill? Is there another place for example, for students to park? And that would be take a larger conversation with you and I and all different stakeholders through a parking study to say, if students are bringing their cars at these kind of ratios, but they're not using them on a day-to-day basis, they're storing them for the weekend or for shopping later, once or twice a week, is there a remote parking solution that would be better than using up the most valuable land on the hill for storing cars? And so, but that I think will have to happen with a larger study.
Perfect. That's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Crane. Anyone else who would like to comment on this ordinance?
Becky Hawbaker. I live at 2309 Iowa Street. I'm also on the College Hill Partnership. I came last time and said that I was one of maybe the few people in the room who had changed her mind on this issue about zoning and also the current development. I was a UNI student, didn't have a car, learned to walk, learned where I could park, where I couldn't park. Students are they're smart. If you ticket their cars, they won't park there. And it's a nice form of city money coming in. The comments about driving people to the Hill is exactly, I think, what Hill businesses want. I love it that the mix of businesses on the Hill has been changing. So not too long ago, it was all bars, and that was not something that I liked as a neighborhood resident. Now we've got a coffee shop, we've got a donut place, we've got more restaurants, and I think if you build that density there and you make it possible to have a walkable community, students won't need to bring their cars. And I teach at UNI. When we have student orientation, parents are always asking, do we really need to send them with a car? We really don't want to send them with a car, and I would love to be able to say, no, you don't need to. We've got enough of what your students need close enough within walking distance to campus that you don't need that, or we have enough public transportation or other kinds of transportation that you don't need that. So I urge the committee to think proactively about. I think that the younger generation has changed. They're different than how we thought and how we operated. I know lots of students my daughter's age that never did driver's ed, don't have their driver's license, never intend to buy a car because they found other ways to exist. And I think that this is a reasonable compromise. I think it's workable, and I really hope to see this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else to address the commission? Seeing none, I guess this time I'll close the public comment period on this and bring it back to the commission for discussion and motion of some sort, hopefully.
Well, I mean, change is hard, and this issue
We
is
need to have
about.
a motion on the floor. Do we have a motion?
Do we have a motion?
No, we don't have a motion.
Oh.
No motion.
He was commenting.
I just brought it back to
Before we can have
commission.
discussion, we need a
Motion first.
motion on the floor?
Do we have to have a motion?
Motion on the floor in order to discuss, yes.
Okay.
I would move that we approve.
Okay, we have a motion to approve. Is there?
Second.
And it's been seconded. Discussion, comment? Go ahead.
I can talk now?
Yes.
Well, this comes down to an issue of change for me and perspective on whether that change is good or bad, and whether density in particular is good or bad. And I was stricken by one of the comments that was made, which was, there's not a way to live in this city without a car. And as if more parking is going to solve that problem. And I guess I would make the argument that the opposite is really true, that if we build density when we build walkable cities, then we're helping that issue. So I guess I come back to the most popular places in this community are the ones with the least amount of parking. So I understand the concerns about the change in the parking, and I appreciate the public debate, but I guess I feel like it's a pretty good thing for this area.
My comment would relate to a parking study that would also involve data from the university, because the university has data on how many parking permits they issue for students relative to how many students are registered on a particular year. Because I think as we look at these multi-use buildings and that they have residential, they have apartments, these are people that are currently not necessarily driving to the Hill every day. They're going to be living there, so we're going to have that higher density. And do they have cars? It's very possible with the higher density that they don't need the car for Cedar Falls. They can walk to class then, if the Hill has businesses that allow them to stay and walk. But many of them, the only way they can go home is to have a car. Now, does the car have to be parked right next door to the building? Maybe not. But what then is the distance that people are willing to walk to get to their cars when they want their cars? Is it 2 blocks? Is it 3 blocks? Is it a half a mile? Is it a mile? And I would hope that some of that would be addressed in a parking study.
My concern with this is we're getting the cart before the horse. We haven't done the study. And I don't know what happens if we do find that we do need 1.75 parking stalls per unit once the study is done and now we don't have it. So I just feel like we should do the study before we make the change.
I do like this change. I understand it could be temporary or it could be permanent. We don't know until the parking study comes, but right now it gives us a measuring device to apply to developments that right now we don't have a way to measure or a rule of thumb to operate from. So I like the zoning change.
I would just want to say thank you to the staff for all the work you've been putting in on this, because I know this has been a very divisive issue. And and I honestly, I don't know what the right parking number is. I mean, I'm not zero parking, but we can overpark too. I think the biggest problem we have right now is kind of today's point. I think you were getting at is we don't have a measure for a part of it. Now the R4 we do, and this is at least we're bringing it all under the same measurement, if you will. Whether it's the right measurement for parking, I don't know. But one thing that's important, I think, is that at least in this case, all developers and property owners have to follow the same rule. So I see it as beneficial, and hopefully we can get that parking study done and get a little more information sooner rather than later on that would be my feeling.
Could you just tell us what's the time frame for actually having the parking study? I mean, are we talking months or weeks?
So the parking study for downtown, the consultant's actually coming next week to give their presentation on the results of the downtown parking study. So that'll be wrapping up pretty quickly here. And I think then the hope is to continue to do that, to move right into the Hill study. But once again, that's up for council to amend that contract or to come up with another plan for doing a study on the Hill. That's for the council to decide. But I think there's interest. I've heard a lot of interest in doing that.
From beginning to end, how long did that take?
I think that we started just a couple months ago, so it can happen fairly quickly. And I'm guessing the same would be for the Hill. I mean, it's not a very large area, so I think it'll be pretty easy to study the actual parking patterns on the Hill.
You've seen some preliminary information, I'm sure, from the study as it's wrapping up here. Are these changes consistent with those recommendations that are being discussed with the group that's doing it.
So there's something to keep in mind here is that there's two kinds of parking here. We're talking about the public parking system, which is, the public parking is that's provided on the Hill and downtown is public, and it's intended for short-term parkers that are doing business on the Hill or doing business downtown, as distinguished from private off-street parking, which is controlled by the zoning ordinance. So the zoning ordinance doesn't have anything to do with the public parking system. So they're studying the public parking, the management of the public parking system in downtown, on street, and in the parking lots, and determining, where the hot spots are downtown, and determining, at peak times, what's the parking availability in the public parking system. Just like on the Hill, there's no parking required for commercial in the downtown, no parking required. That's been a pretty standard, good practice known across the country. That's been in place for about 20 years. Most progressive downtown urban areas have eliminated their commercial parking requirements, focusing on the shared parking system that's often the public parking system then. So that's kind of what the study is doing, is looking at that public parking system, but also looking at the private off-street parking that's been created due to the ratios that we have in our code for residential, to see what the parking utilization is in those private lots. And what they've been discovering is that a lot of those lots are empty part of the time, a good portion of those, and so it could be that the ratio is set a little bit too high. And then the idea is, how do we get those lots, if you've taken off private land for private parking, then the rest of the public can't park there. So there's not as much flexibility to share something that's not public. So I think the idea with an urban area is you try to get as much sharing as possible to be more efficient with the use of the land. That's kind of a long answer to the question, but I think as far as the ratios that are in the zoning ordinance, those would only affect the private off-street parking that's required.
I would agree with you on that. However, if there is no private parking, then it's going to be shared parking with the public lots. So you do have to look at it all together. I understand from zoning ordinance it's separate, but it all comes out of one pot. There's 20 acres of land and there's whatever, how many cars.
Right.
So yeah, even though we have to separate it zoning-wise, I get that, but it still comes down to, if there's 20,000 people and there's only using one area and there's only 5,000 parking spots, is that enough? You know what I mean? So I do understand what you're saying, but we got to think globally too.
Right. So I think that's exactly what they're trying to do, though, is saying, if we're requiring too much off-street private parking, that takes up land that might have been used for public parking, that could have been more efficiently shared then. So I think it's looking at all the land holistically, as you said, and to make sure that we're coming up with the most efficient pattern to park the cars, because
I just noticed, in successful urban areas where you have a lot of activity, it's public parking. There's substantial public parking, and that's key because of kind of the transient nature to get people in and out. So,
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that distinguishes, we're a smaller city trying to become urban and dense versus the larger cities who are urban and dense. They do have more public parking places, they have parking ramps, and our little 6-block area, we're limited there. So I understand that. And even up on the hill, you're limited, so.
Well, we have a motion to approve the zoning code text amendments for the College Hill Neighborhood Overlay Zoning District. Is there further discussion or comment from the commission? Seeing none, we will go ahead and vote. We have 3 ayes, 3 nays, and 1 abstention.
Are you voting tonight? We're a little shorthanded. Marty, we probably need the chair to vote as well. We're going to end up with a lot of ties tonight.
Okay.
That's up to you, but I think Hillary usually votes.
I will
He abstained. That was the-
will change my vote to an aye then.
What was that? I'm
Want to
sorry.
revote?
I will change my vote to a yes.
Okay. Did you get the votes down then?
Like to revote?
Can you just show me one more time what the votes were? Sorry.
I can't.
We cleared it.
Well, we've got it recorded, so.
So that motion carries. We'll move on to old business, and that's the College Hill Neighborhood Overlay District Site Plan Review for 2119 College Street. And David, are you introducing this one?
Marty, I just want to note that on this one, I will not be abstaining. There's no reason for me to do so. I do not have any direct conflict with this project.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wingert.
All right, thank you, Mr. Holtz. Yeah, this item was presented last meeting on December 12th, and it's a College Hill Commercial Overlay District site plan review for a mixed-use building at 2119 College Street. And you can see the property there on the aerial photo. It's in the C3 zoning district near the northwest corner of College and 22nd. Move it along here. The site plan here is there's a building out front, which is the narrow part there at 2119, and then associated parking lot in the back with 47 stalls. And there's a table that kind of summarizes the type of development there. We've got commercial on the main floor and four stories of residential, and the breakdown of studio units and bedrooms there for a total of 31 units and 47 beds and 47 stalls. And then again, that's broken down as one stall per studio unit and then one stall per bedroom, basically. So that's what it lays out. Just kind of, again, summarizing College Hill Overlay District in section 29-160, which is part of the commercial district within that overlay district. And basically that section G states that in that C3 district, it's commercial use, primarily reserved for those principal commercial uses on those properties. And then later on in that section is, in some cases, residential uses may be contained within that commercial use and are considered to be secondary or accessory to those principal commercial uses as located on those properties. And then just moving along down that section there, it basically says as those secondary or accessory residential uses are to be established on the upper floors of those principal commercial uses, and then on-site parking will not be required for those residential uses. It further goes into, we want to make sure that the main floor is commercial. You don't want to eat up all that minimum, we got small commercial areas for that, so we want to make sure that's commercial uses. And then it goes into the review by the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council to make sure that those mixed-use buildings and site plans are reviewed that way. And so the proposed development does include the 47 parking stalls behind that building. So just moving along, these changes really kind of the same as last time, but again, just before last time, we did take a closer look at that east elevation along the sidewalk along College Street. There's a little elevation change from the south corner to the north corner. We wanted to make sure that the main entrance to that building is at level, so to make sure those access is easy into that space. Moving along to the back here, it's just kind of elevation change, drawings from the back side when you're in the parking lot, and then on the corner there on College Street as you're looking towards the building. And so basically the building is made up of basically 3-4 materials, which is brick, couple brick patterns there, and metal panel patterns of vertical and horizontal. So you show the breakdowns on those 4 facades of the building. And then this just shows a height study of those of the proposed building then in relation to the existing buildings on site. Primarily, they're a church and some university buildings in that immediate area. And then kind of a topo elevation cross-section there as you show 23rd Street up on the left side there as you, of the hill next to you and I, and then moving down to 22nd Street as that, the hill, so to speak, as you travel north. So basically, in summary, the height of the building is 5 stories, roughly 61.5 feet tall. Again, most of the commercial areas are 1 to 2 stories, but there are other similar buildings of the same height in that area. Setbacks aren't required there in the C3 district, but it does show there's a 5-foot setback along College Street. There's a utility easement in that area, so that's behind the sidewalk area. So the building is going to be set back 5 feet from that area. There's 5 feet along the south side and 6 feet along the north side. And then the parking lot in the back has the required setbacks. So just kind of moving along with that site plan and just showing them some of those elements. The dumpster enclosure is located in the northwest corner of the parking lot, and then next to underground detention basin that will collect all that surface runoff from the parking area and then route it to the storm sewer along College Street. We have bike racks in the front of the building and behind the building. And along College Street, there's an existing driveway that kind of runs just to the north side of the corner building, so that will be removed and then replaced with sidewalks and pavers. And they're going to add another tree grate there on the south side just to kind of mirror the other 3 trees on the east side of the street. So basically, this parking lot plan meets all the setbacks, all the landscaping requirements that are identified in the ordinance. So basically, we want to move along and recommend approval of this site plan, conform to all the city staff recommendations. Again, I mentioned this last meeting, we are developing a parking agreement for this project to make sure that those parking stalls stay with the building according to the zoning code and possibly what could be changed. So right now, it does show those stalls in the back. And then any comments from the commission at this time?
Thank you, David. At this time, I'll open to the public for any comment on this item. Please come forward and state your name and address. Or actually, you're going to represent the applicant, right?
Sure.
I should be giving you a first shot anyway, so.
Dan Drendel, Slingshot Architecture, representing the applicant. So again, just starting off from where we were, we're happy to have some clarity to the zoning code, and so we executed this plan, this revision to what you've seen before to accomplish that. We still think that the project provides that density that people are that the planning documents are calling for that area, sets us up for good success going down the road. In that area that has the easement, the utility easement that we talked about on College Street, that site area will be utilized as a beer garden in the concept. So trying to work with all the constraints of the site to provide a really active experience and add people to the area that can walk and visit the shops and use that. There's a roof deck on the top level that'll look back down up College. So we're excited to add this to the neighborhood. We're excited to provide a building that is rich in materiality, that doesn't have a backside. We know being taller than particularly the low-scale building that was just built next to it, that we're visible up and down the street. And so that's why the material palette really extends the full 4 sides of the building. As usual, I'm here if you guys have any questions as you guys get to your discussion. But thank you for your work going through the adjustments in the zoning and getting to this point where we can pass this project, and we appreciate your support. Thank you.
Now I'll open it to anybody else who would like to comment on this project. Please come forward and give your name and address.
Kamyar and Cheyenne, 1703 Washington Street, board member of the College Hill Partnership. The entire board unanimously supports this project. We're very excited. Offers all kinds of opportunities, new commercial areas, residential. The existing building that's there is not very pretty, and we're glad that there will be a nicer building in its place, and so that a lot of us can walk to more businesses that are on the hill. We really appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nshayan. Others who would like to comment on this proposal?
Ishan Vajpayee, 3831 Convair Lane. One of the comments was that there's a parking agreement to be developed, and maybe I missed it, but I don't know if it's out yet, been released yet. But this goes back to what we were just talking about. We're not sure if this parking ratio is the right number because we don't have the study yet. We're thinking that maybe someday we'll talk to you and I about developing an off-site parking lot in partnership with them. But let's go ahead and pass this code amendment now. We'll maybe get a parking study for the Hill after City Council approves it and it's done. But let's pass this ordinance now. And if it doesn't work, we'll just revisit it, but after a building's been erected and built over the parking. And this does have applicability to this project because I'm not going to bore anybody with the details of why I think this project does not meet the current city code. 4 stories is more than 1. Secondary means smaller than principal. But if you believe that, and then you still vote to put this project through, you're just assuming that the ordinance changes that coming through this body are going to be approved by council over there, counting on it. Again, just putting not just 1 cart, putting 2 carts, putting the whole train in front of the engine here is what's happening. On the last vote, honestly, and on this vote as well. Last meeting, I think the developer welcomed a table of the issue, but for some reason there's this push to go now, with these uncertainties, and once this thing goes up, that's it. And someone mentioned something, we don't have a good measuring stick for what the right ratio is. Well, how about a parking study? That could be done in a few months, and I doubt anyone wants to break ground on the foundation of this place in February anyhow. This is about good governance. This is about the appearance that the process is being respected, that you don't assume that council is going to pass the ordinance which makes this building legal. I don't think anyone could be going down the road at 55 miles an hour in a 45 zone and say, officer, I heard that they're going to make this 55 next week. Don't write me the ticket. We got to wait here. And then I'm just going to touch on this real briefly. I read in the Courier after the last meeting that the complaints about Mr. Wingert's recusal were based on some past relationships with the applicant, and I don't want to belabor this, but it's current relationships. And Mr. Wingert was kind enough to provide comments to the letter that you should all have in your packet. And those are well taken, and this is not a personal attack on his ethics or moral integrity, but I do think it's a little inaccurate to say that his business paths cross with the applicant. It's not a crossing, it's a full-fledged partnership. This would be the only developer from which he'd have to recuse based on such a substantial relationship, so I think he could still serve in an effective capacity on other projects, other things. And, a well-known tenet of judicial recusal, and this is a quasi-judicial body. That's why you have this ex parte order. is that it's not just required to recuse when there's an actual impropriety, but when there could be the appearance of an impropriety. And this is back to the good governance issue. When someone who hasn't been coming to all these meetings reads about what happens here or hears about what happens here, are they going to hear that a building got passed through with 4 floors called secondary versus principal because we're assuming it's going to be legal after that body maybe passes it through? Does that sound right? Does that sound like good governance? Is a person who hears that Mr. Wingert has listed $7.9 million of real estate for Mr. Dahlstrom right now going to think that there's not a potential conflict there? That they're co-signed on, let's do the math here, $10.9 million worth of mortgages right now and have borrowed about $60 million worth of mortgages in their entire partnership? Is that going to look good? Is that going to pass the smell test for an average citizen? The appearance of impropriety is important. The process is important. Even if the fix isn't in, and I'm not saying the fix is in, but making it sure that it doesn't seem like the fix is in is incredibly important here. And that's why at least this vote needs to be tabled or turned down until the ordinance gets sorted out. And I've made my record on the recusal issue, so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vashpay. Anyone else in the audience who would like to address the commission on this item?
Just a point of clarification to just Mr. Vajpayee's comment about the commission should be voting on this based on the current ordinance on the books, not based on what future ordinance might be. We have an unfortunate fact that we have these things on the table at the same time, but I just wanted to make that clarification. You have staff's recommendation that we believe it does meet the ordinance requirements. There may be a difference of opinion, but it's up for you to decide that for this particular item.
So yeah, so that, and we can't tie this subject one to the other is the other thing I think was discussed.
There's a couple choices here. You can table this item. You can vote on it tonight. Either way, that's your choice to do that.
We can defer as well. If I
Yes, you
remember
can.
correctly, that's what we did the last time
Yes.
because tabling required it to go back through from the very beginning. Deferring it allowed it to be brought back.
Yes,
to the
that's
meeting this
correct.
evening.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So you have some options.
So you couldn't approve it as subject to approval of the ordinance?
Right, because, yeah, it's prejudging that. Yeah, we can't.
When does that go to council? What date's that at council?
So we can lay out a schedule for you. So what we have to do with a code amendment item is typically we take it to a work session with council first, which would be at actually January 21st meeting. And then after that, they'd have to set a public hearing at the following meeting in February. Second meeting in February would be the actual hearing. And then they vote the first hearing, and so then it would take 2 more votes, so it would be passed by the end of March then, if it all went as I just laid out.
Also this item on that last meeting.
I should, I'm going to close the public portion of this item also now, and then bring it back to the commission for discussion and action. And I guess I would just want to note that, I mean, I'm not comfortable voting for this until after the results of the zoning code amendments are known, because I don't believe that it, in its current form, would meet the current zoning. That's my position on that. So until that, until that's successful, I would defer or table or whatever this item. And otherwise, I feel that I have to vote in the negative. So that's where I sit.
I agree with you. I feel the same way.
And I feel the same as well.
So I would move to refer it.
To defer it?
Refer it, or defer it, that's
Defer.
it. Defer it. Not table, defer.
And I will second that motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to defer this item.
You can defer it to a date certain. It doesn't have to be necessarily the next meeting, but you could defer it to a future meeting.
At what point would you feel comfortable that?
I'm just saying that's an option.
Yeah, okay. So I asked the question, is there a date you feel that the zoning text amendments would have gone through council?
It's actually to predict something. I kind of laid out a general schedule by the end of March, but you can choose to do it to your next meeting, and then you can continue to defer it if that's easier to do that. And just for.
I would move to defer it until this zoning ordinance is voted on, so after we know the results of that vote.
Yeah, could it be structured that way?
Sounds like it'll
Yeah, I
be
mean,
sometime, maybe just defer it till late February if that's what they're looking at. I mean, you have to put a date on it.
I think we could probably do that, defer it until council votes on the code amendments, if that's what you decide to do, and then we'll just we'll renotice.
Well, yeah, it's your motion.
That's what I would prefer to.
Okay.
I move to defer this until the code amendments have been voted on by city council.
Deb?
I will second that.
And Deb will still second that. Okay, so we have a motion and a second to defer this item until such time as the code amendments have, the previous item has gone through the process with the city council. Is there further discussion? Comment? Seeing none, we will go ahead and vote on this item. And we have all ayes for that.
No.
Oh, and one no. Sorry. 6 ayes and 1 no. So that motion does carry, so that will be deferred to a future date. So that completes all of our regular items of agenda items tonight. Well, Karen, do you have any commission updates?
Once again, just wanted to mention that if you're interested in the parking study presentation, that's next Wednesday from 6 to 8 at the Cedar Falls Community Center down on Main Street next to the library. So that should be kind of an interesting presentation of the parking study down there, maybe give a preview of similar process that might occur in College Hill. And then I just want to give you an update. We are moving forward with the downtown visioning and zoning code update. Just a little update on that. We have interviewed a few consultant teams, and we're very pleased to have some very skilled consultants that have proposed for the project. So we're hoping to have somebody on board fairly soon to kick off that project in the downtown area. So we're very excited about that process.
All right, thank you very much. We entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.